There is a day in a man's life that no one prepares him for. It doesn't come with applause. It doesn't arrive as success. It doesn't even look like happiness. It arrives quietly, often after disappointment, often after betrayal, often after exhaustion. It is the day a man finally chooses himself. Not because he wants to hurt anyone, not because he becomes selfish, but because he realizes that for far too long he has been disappearing. Most men don't lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves slowly, through small compromises, through unspoken resentment, through the habit of being understanding, through the belief that their needs can wait. And society rewards this. A man who endures silently is called strong. A man who sacrifices endlessly is called noble. A man who never complains is called mature. But no one tells him what it costs. No one tells him that one day he will wake up and feel like a stranger in his own life. This is usually where it begins, not with anger, but with emptiness. He has the job, he has the responsibilities. He may even have the relationship, yet something feels off. He feels tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. He feels irritated by things that never used to bother him. He feels distant from people he claims to love. And worst of all, he doesn't recognize himself anymore. This is the moment most men try to distract themselves. They work harder, they scroll longer. They joke more, they suppress deeper, because facing the truth is uncomfortable. The truth is this: he has been living a life built around expectations that were never fully his. Expected to be strong, expected to provide, expected to tolerate, expected to adjust, but never expected to ask, what do I need? The day a man chooses himself is the day he finally asks that question and doesn't run from the answer. At first, the answer scares him, because what he realizes is painful. He realizes he's been over giving in places where he was undervalued. He realizes he's been loyal to people who were only loyal to his usefulness. He realizes he's been afraid of disappointing others more than disappointing himself, and this realization hurts. But pain, when understood, becomes clarity. This is where the shift begins. A man choosing himself does not become loud, he becomes precise. He stops explaining himself to people who never listened. He stops negotiating his boundaries. He stops chasing validation. Not aggressively, not dramatically, quietly, because he finally understands something most men learn too late. Your life changes not when people start treating you better, but when you stop accepting treatment that diminishes you. This is when he starts setting boundaries, and boundaries are uncomfortable, especially for men who are raised to be accommodating. At first, he feels guilty, he feels like he's being selfish, he feels like he's letting people down, but slowly he realizes something important. Anyone who benefits from you having no boundaries will resist you the moment you create them. This is where many men hesitate. They think, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe I should go back to how I was. Maybe this discomfort means I'm doing something wrong. No, this discomfort means you are doing something new, and growth always feels unfamiliar. Choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop abandoning yourself in the process. A man who chooses himself starts listening not to noise, but to his intuition. He notices how certain people make him feel drained. He notices how certain conversations leave him doubting himself. He notices how certain environments keep him small. And for the first time, he allows himself to step back. This is where his life truly starts to change, because the moment a man stops chasing approval, he becomes selective with his energy. He no longer tries to be liked by everyone. He no longer explains his worth. He no longer begs to be chosen. He chooses himself first, and something interesting happens when he does. People either rise to meet his standards or fall away. And this is not a loss, it is alignment. The men who choose themselves often go through a period of loneliness. This is important to understand. Loneliness doesn't mean you made the wrong choice. It means you've outgrown old dynamics before new ones arrive. Most men quit here. They return to familiarity because solitude feels uncomfortable. But the man who keeps going, the man who stays true, experiences something powerful. He begins to feel peaceful, not excited, not euphoric, peaceful. And peace is dangerous because once a man tastes it, he refuses to live without it again. He starts investing in himself, physically, mentally, emotionally, not to impress, not to prove, but because he finally understands his value. He trains his body not for attention, but for discipline. He sharpens his mind not for ego, but for clarity. He heals emotionally not to erase pain, but to stop repeating patterns. This is where confidence is born, not loud confidence, not performative confidence, quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need validation, the kind that doesn't chase, the kind that doesn't beg. Women feel this, people sense this. Life responds to this, because when a man chooses himself, he stops asking, am I enough? And starts asking, is this aligned with who I am becoming? That question changes everything. He no longer fears being alone. He fears losing himself again. He no longer tolerates disrespect. He addresses it or walks away. He no longer overextends. He gives intentionally. And suddenly, opportunities shift, not magically, psychologically, because the man who respects himself teaches the world how to treat him. This is not arrogance, this is self-trust, and self-trust is magnetic. This is the moment his entire life changes, not because circumstances transformed overnight, but because he did, and once that happens, there is no going back. There is something deeply uncomfortable about a man who has chosen himself, not because he is aggressive, not because he is arrogant, but because he is no longer easily controlled. Most people are used to the version of him that was predictable, the version that always showed up, the version that always adjusted, the version that always forgave quickly and forgot slowly. So when he begins to change, people feel it before they understand it. They say things like, "You've changed, you're not the same anymore, you've become distant." What they really mean is, you no longer respond the way we expect. And that's when the man realizes something crucial. Growth will always disappoint those who benefited from your silence. Choosing himself means he stops performing emotional labor for people who never reciprocated. He stops fixing problems that aren't his responsibility. He stops carrying guilt that was never his to begin with. And this is where many men feel fear, because for the first time they are no longer needed in the same way. But being needed is not the same as being valued. A man who chooses himself understands this difference deeply. He would rather be respected than required. He would rather be wanted than used. He would rather be alone than slowly erased. This shift affects his relationships first, romantic relationships especially. When a man chooses himself, he no longer chases emotional availability. He no longer over-explains his intentions. He no longer competes for affection. He observes, he listens, he notices whether effort is mutual. He notices whether respect is consistent. He notices whether words match behavior, and if they don't, he doesn't argue, he withdraws, not emotionally as punishment, but energetically as protection. This is powerful, because nothing unsettles people more than a man who no longer reacts the way he used to. Women in particular feel this shift strongly, not because he becomes cold, but because he becomes grounded. He is no longer desperate for connection, he is selective about it, and selectivity is attractive. A man who chooses himself stops making a woman the center of his universe. He invites her into a life that already has structure, purpose, and direction. This changes the dynamic completely, because attraction does not grow in imbalance, it grows in polarity. And polarity requires self-respect. This is where many men misunderstand the concept. Choosing yourself does not mean you become emotionally unavailable. It means you become emotionally responsible. You stop outsourcing your happiness. You stop expecting others to heal what you refuse to face. You stop blaming relationships for wounds you never addressed. A man who chooses himself looks inward. He asks difficult questions. Why do I tolerate disrespect? Why do I fear being alone? Why do I overgive? Why do I attach so quickly? Why do I lose myself in relationships? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are transformative, because once a man understands his patterns, he stops repeating them. And this is where life starts responding differently, not instantly, but consistently. His confidence becomes stable, his decisions become intentional, his presence becomes heavier. People listen when he speaks, not because he's louder, but because he's certain. This certainty spills into his work. He no longer works to escape himself, he works to build something meaningful. He becomes disciplined, not obsessive, focused, not frantic. He understands that success without self-respect still feels empty, so he builds slowly, deliberately, and this patience pays off, because a man who chooses himself does not chase quick wins. He builds foundations. This is when his identity solidifies. He no longer introduces himself by his struggles. He no longer defines himself by his past. He no longer seeks approval to feel valid. He knows who he is, and more importantly, he knows who he is not willing to become again. This is the turning point. The moment a man says, "I will never abandon myself like that again." That promise changes everything. He becomes less reactive, less impulsive, less desperate. He pauses before responding. He thinks before committing. He walks away before resentment builds. This emotional regulation is strength, real strength, not suppression, not avoidance, and awareness is rare. Most men live unconsciously, reactively, on autopilot. The man who chooses himself becomes intentional, and intentional men create powerful lives. This is also when his standards rise, not out of entitlement, but out of clarity. He knows what drains him. He knows what nourishes him. He knows what aligns with his values. So he stops tolerating chaos disguised as passion. He stops romanticizing inconsistency. He stops calling anxiety love. He chooses peace. And peace becomes addictive because once you experience a life without constant emotional turbulence, you realize how much energy you were wasting. This is when his nervous system calms, his sleep improves, his focus sharpens, his body responds to safety, and this internal safety allows him to expand. He becomes more creative, more confident, more decisive. People feel safer around him, not because he tries to lead, but because he is anchored. This is leadership, quiet, stable, grounded, and life starts opening doors. Not because he begged for opportunities, but because he was ready for them. The man who chooses himself stops rushing. He understands that timing matters, that growth cannot be forced, that alignment cannot be faked. He allows life to meet him where he stands. And it does. There is a moment that comes after a man has chosen himself that no one talks about. It's not confidence. It's not success. It's not even happiness. It's grief. Grief for the version of himself that didn't know any better. Grief for the years he spent proving his worth to people who never intended to see it. Grief for the boundaries he didn't set, the standards he ignored, the instincts he silenced. This grief is necessary because healing does not begin with empowerment, it begins with honesty. A man who chooses himself allows himself to feel this loss without numbing it, without rushing past it, without pretending it doesn't matter. And in that grief, he finally forgives himself, not for being weak, but for surviving the only way he knew how. This self-forgiveness is powerful. Because once a man stops being at war with his past, he stops repeating it. He begins to rewire the way he relates to pain. Instead of asking, why did this happen to me? He asks, what is this trying to teach me? And this shift in perspective changes everything. He no longer sees rejection as a verdict on his worth. He sees it as redirection. He no longer sees failure as humiliation. He sees it as refinement. This is emotional maturity. And emotional maturity is what separates boys from men. A man who chooses himself stops outsourcing his identity. He doesn't define himself by a woman's approval. He doesn't define himself by social validation. He doesn't define himself by external success alone. He builds an internal compass, values, principles, non-negotiables. These become his anchor. So when life shakes him, and it will, he doesn't collapse, he adjusts. This is resilience, not the kind that hardens the heart, but the kind that strengthens it. And something fascinating happens here. The man who once feared abandonment becomes comfortable with detachment, not cold detachment, healthy detachment. He understands that love cannot be forced, that loyalty cannot be negotiated, that respect cannot be begged for. So he stops chasing people who are unsure about him. He lets them go. And in doing so, he creates space for alignment, space for growth, space for people who meet him where he stands. This is when attraction changes, because attraction is not about proving yourself. It's about being settled within yourself. A man who chooses himself becomes less available. Not because he is playing games, but because his life is full of purpose, full of discipline, full of direction. And when a man has direction, he becomes magnetic. Women sense this. Not because he tries to impress them, but because he isn't trying to. He listens more than he speaks. He observes more than he reacts. He chooses connection deliberately. This makes him unpredictable in the best way, because people can no longer manipulate him through guilt. They can no longer control him through fear of loss. They can no longer access him without effort, and effort is the currency of value. The man who chooses himself understands this intuitively. He no longer overshares to feel close. He allows intimacy to build naturally. He lets people earn access to his inner world. This is emotional strength, and emotional strength creates trust, because people feel safe around a man who is not seeking something from them. This safety changes dynamics everywhere, and friendships, in work, in family. He stops being reactive to criticism. He listens without internalizing. He responds without defending, because when you are secure in who you are, feedback no longer feels like an attack. It feels like information. This is when leadership emerges naturally, not dominance, not control, presence. People start seeking his opinion. They start respecting his decisions. They start following his lead. And he doesn't chase this role. It finds him. Because leadership is a byproduct of self-trust. This is also when the man realizes something profound. He realizes that peace is more valuable than being right. That growth is more important than comfort. That alignment is more fulfilling than attention. So he simplifies his life. He cuts out noise. He limits distractions. He becomes intentional with his time. Because time is the one thing he will never get back. And once a man understands the value of his time, he becomes unstoppable. He invests it wisely in skills, in health, in meaningful relationships, in long-term goals. He stops chasing shortcuts. He stops rushing outcomes. He stops comparing his path to others. Comparison loses its grip when a man knows where he's going. This is when purpose becomes clear, not as a sudden revelation, but as a steady pull. He feels drawn to work that challenges him, to responsibilities that stretch him, to goals that require discipline. And discipline becomes his ally, not punishment, structure. Structure creates freedom, because when your life has structure, you no longer feel lost. This man doesn't need motivation. He has commitment, and commitment outlasts emotion. This is the version of a man that life responds to differently, because he is no longer asking for permission to exist. He is no longer waiting to be chosen. He has already chosen himself. And once that happens, the world adjusts. There comes a stage after a man has chosen himself, where his life no longer feels reactive. He is no longer constantly responding to crisis, no longer adjusting his mood based on other people's behavior, no longer living in emotional survival mode. For the first time, he is leading his own life. This is subtle, but it is powerful, because when a man stops reacting, he starts creating. He begins to live intentionally. He chooses how he starts his mornings. He chooses what he allows into his mind. He chooses where his energy goes. And energy is everything. The man who once scattered it everywhere now protects it fiercely, not out of fear, but out of respect for himself. He understands something most men never learn. Your energy is your life force. Where you spend it determines who you become. So he stops engaging in pointless arguments, stops entertaining emotional chaos, stops chasing people who are unsure. He becomes decisive, and decisiveness is rare. This decisiveness shows up in his body language, in the way he walks, in the way he speaks. There is less explanation, less justification, less need to be understood by everyone. Because he understands himself, this inner clarity changes how others perceive him. He is no longer seen as nice but forgettable. He is seen as grounded, as reliable, as solid, and solidity is attractive. In a world full of uncertainty, a man who knows himself stands out. This is also when temptation appears. Not temptation in the obvious sense, but the temptation to go back to old dynamics, back to old versions of himself that felt familiar. This is the real test, because familiarity is seductive, even when it is unhealthy. But the man who has truly chosen himself recognizes this trap. He understands that comfort is not the same as growth. So when loneliness visits him, and he does not run back to chaos. He sits with it, he uses it. Loneliness becomes a mirror. It shows him where he still seeks validation, where he still fears rejection, where he still doubts his worth. And instead of judging himself, he works on it patiently, consistently. This is maturity. This is what separates a man who changes temporarily from a man who transforms permanently. Transformation is not loud. It does not announce itself. It happens in private moments, in the choice to go to the gym when no one is watching, in the discipline to say no to distractions, courage to walk away from misalignment. These small choices compound, and one day the man looks around and realizes his life feels different, not perfect, but aligned. He feels proud, not in an arrogant way, but in a grounded way. He knows he can trust himself. This trust is priceless, because once a man trusts himself, he stops seeking reassurance. He stops asking others to confirm his decisions. He stops doubting his instincts, and instincts sharpen when they are finally listened to. This affects his relationships profoundly. He no longer enters relationships to fill a void. He enters them to share a life. He no longer tolerates inconsistency. He addresses it calmly, or he leaves. No drama, no threats. No emotional manipulation, just clarity, and clarity commands respect. Women feel safe with a man like this, not because he promises security, but because he embodies it. He is emotionally regulated. He is present. He is honest. He does not love from fear. He loves from choice. This is rare, because most people love from need. A man who chooses himself does not need to be chosen. He wants to be chosen. And that difference is everything. This is when love becomes healthy, mutual, balanced, respectful. And if such love does not appear, he remains at peace alone. This peace is his greatest achievement, because a man who is at peace alone cannot be manipulated through fear of loss. He cannot be rushed. He cannot be controlled. He cannot be diminished. This is power, quiet power, the kind that lasts. This power also reshapes his vision of success. Success is no longer about proving something to the world. It is about building a life that feels meaningful. He defines success on his own terms. Maybe it's financial freedom, maybe it's creative fulfillment, maybe it's impact, maybe it's legacy. But whatever it is, it aligns with his values. He no longer chases what looks good. He builds what feels right. And because of this alignment, he can endure setbacks. He can handle criticism. He can survive failure, because his identity is not fragile. This is the man who becomes a pillar for his family, for his partner, for his community. Not because he sacrifices himself, but because he stands firmly in who he is. This is the paradox most people miss. A man becomes more available to others when he stops abandoning himself. This is the moment his entire life changes. Not in one dramatic event, but in 1,000 small, disciplined decisions. And once this shift happens, there is no going back, because the man who has chosen himself would rather face discomfort then return to self-betrayal, there comes a final realization in a man's journey that changes how he sees everything. He realizes that choosing himself was never about becoming more important than others. It was about becoming whole, because a man who is fractured inside cannot build anything stable outside, not a relationship, not a family, not a legacy. And legacy, this is where his thinking shifts completely. He understands that legacy is not about fame, not about attention, not about being remembered by strangers. Legacy is about impact. It is about how people feel in your presence. It is about the standard you set. It is about the life you model silently. The man who chooses himself understands that someone is always watching, a younger brother, a son, a friend, a colleague, and even if no one is watching, he lives in a way that he can respect. This is integrity. Integrity is not perfection. It is alignment between who you are and how you live. And once a man has integrity, he becomes unshakable because he no longer needs to pretend. He no longer lives two lives, one for the world and one he hides from himself. He becomes consistent. What you see is what you get. This consistency creates trust. People trust him with responsibility, with leadership, with opportunities, because he does not chase power, he is capable of holding it. This is the difference. Most men want the outcome without becoming the man who can sustain it. But the man who chooses himself understands everything you want requires a version of you that you have not yet become. So he becomes that man, slowly, deliberately, relentlessly. He understands that motivation is unreliable, but discipline is loyal. So he builds habits of reflection, habits of physical care, habits of learning, habits of restraint. Restraint becomes one of his greatest strengths. He does not react to every insult. He does not chase every opportunity. He does not engage in every battle because not everything deserves his energy. This discernment makes him powerful. In a world addicted to noise, he becomes calm. In a world addicted to instant gratification, he becomes patient. In a world addicted to validation, he becomes self-sufficient, and self-sufficiency is freedom. Freedom from approval, freedom from fear, freedom from emotional dependency. This does not make him cold. It makes him generous. Selectively, he gives where it is, he invests where there is growth. He commits where there is alignment, and he walks away where there is disrespect. Without bitterness, without revenge, without drama. This emotional neutrality is mastery because it means he is no longer controlled by external circumstances. This is the final shift, the irreversible one, the moment where a man realizes that no one is coming to save him, and that is not a tragedy, it is liberation. He stops waiting for permission, stops waiting for understanding, stops waiting for the right time. He acts. He takes responsibility for his life fully, not blaming his past, not resenting his parents, not resenting women, not resenting society. He acknowledges what happened and moves forward anyway. This accountability is where power lives, because once you accept responsibility, you gain control, and control over your life is the greatest form of confidence. This man no longer asks, what if I fail? He asks, what if I don't try? Because regret becomes scarier than failure. He understands that pain is temporary, but self-betrayal leaves scars. So he chooses courage again. And again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's lonely, even when no one claps. And one day, often quietly, he looks at his life and realizes something extraordinary. He is proud. Not because everything worked out, but because he showed up, he honored himself, he became the man he once needed. And that is the moment his life truly changes. Not when he gets the relationship, not when he makes the money, not when he gains status, but when he can sit alone in silence and feel at peace with who he is. This is the destination. This is what choosing yourself gives you. And once you have this, nothing can take it away, because the man who chooses himself cannot be undone. He may stumble, he may fall, he may suffer, but he will never abandon himself again. And that is the strongest man you will ever meet. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels stirred, this is not coincidence. This is recognition. Because the day a man chooses himself is not a future event. It is a decision, one you can make today. And the moment you do, your entire life begins to change.